If you live in Bradford, you've driven by this building thousands of times and probably never realized it's one of the most historic buildings in the city. It's also the oldest brick building in the city. It was built in 1876 as an opera house. And it's kind of ironic that its name is now Moments to Remember, because boy, do we have a lot of moments to remember about this building. Stay tuned for another edition of Coffee with the Curator. The Wagner Opera House was named for Martin Wagner, although he actually had a silent partner. It was an opera house, but not what you normally would think of as opera. Sure, they had operas there, and Marilyn Horne probably would have sang there in her time if she were alive back in, say, 1880. But opera houses throughout the entire United States were more like a community center. They had plays, lectures, minstrel shows, and traveling entertainers. The Wagner also had comedians, magicians, boxing matches, and occasionally a real opera. In March 1888, they had 6 operas in one night and advertised them as cheap and good. Now, I think operas are either good or cheap, but I'm not sure they can be both. The next night, after those operas, they hosted the Lafayette College Glee, Banjo, and Mandolin Club. And the night after that was the Humpty Dumptys. They were a clown act who did pantomime in whiteface. That is wrong in so many ways. Another good example of people who became really famous later but played at the Wagner was in November of 1894 on Thanksgiving Day. A comedy troupe played at the Wagner Theater, and 2 of the performers were Josie Cohen, described as a refined and graceful dancer, and her brother, George M. Cohen, yes, that George M. Cohen, who was advertised as the funniest of boys' specialty artists. He was 16 years old when he played Bradford, and he went on to become famous, of course, as that Yankee Doodle dandy and a famous songwriter. There are no photographs of the inside of the Wagner Opera House, but it probably looked a lot like this. It was a proscenium theater. A simple one. You've probably seen this type many times. Basically, a stage, a curtain. The curtain comes down, and the actors go behind it. Now, Wagner had founded the theater in 1876, but by 1878, he's so successful that he decided to expand it. Most opera houses in the 19th century were generally on the second floor of a 2- or 3-story building, and the Wagner Opera House was exactly like that. You went down a long hallway, about 25 feet, a short set of stairs, and that would lead you to what they called the dress circle, which we know as the mezzanine. You would then go downstairs to what they called the parquet, which is the ground floor. The ground floor of the Wagner held about 400 seats. This is the only known photograph of the building at 62 Main Street when it was known as the Wagner Opera House. This photograph was taken in August of 1888. And those men in front are Civil War soldiers. This was taken during the reunion of the GAR, or the Grand Army of the Republic, an organization formed after the war. The building, of course, has changed over the years. One of the earliest entertainers or lecturers to appear at the Wagner was this man, Dr. Isaac Hayes, a physician and Arctic explorer. He had been a ship's surgeon on one of Elijah Kane's ships in 1853, and by the time he appeared in Bradford in 1878, he was considered the most prolific lecturer and writer on the Arctic in the 19th century. He believed that there was an ice-free ocean surrounding the North Pole, and did several expeditions trying to prove that. He appeared at the Wagner in December of 1878, but died in 1881 of a heart attack. Interesting articles about him can be found on the internet if you'd like to read more about his theory, his life, and his expeditions. One of the most famous actors ever to appear at the Wagner Opera House was this man, Edwin Booth, a renowned American actor who was famous for his role of Hamlet. He played Hamlet here on December 29th of 1886. His life perhaps was overshadowed by the actions of his younger brother, John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Abraham Lincoln in 1865. But Edwin Booth himself was a renowned actor, and some considered him the greatest American actor and the greatest portrayal of Prince Hamlet of the 19th century. He played the role for over 100 performances. Tickets for the play that night were very expensive by 1886 standards. Each ticket was $2.50, and they said people scraped and saved their money so that they could see the greatest actor, Edwin Booth. The Era wrote it was a great dramatic treat, and he was Shakespeare's master. More than half a century, 30 years of which Mr. Booth has passed on the stage, have wrinkled his finely chiseled yet classical features, but they have not dimmed his eye or slackened his professional stage pace. It was said, he seemed a familiar character as Hamlet, and his acting, if such a thing could be said, became vastly superior with age. Let's not forget the ladies who played at the Wagner Opera House as well. This is Lily Langtry, also known as the Jersey Dove. She was born on the island of Jersey, which is a channel island between France and England, in 1853, and became world famous as the most beautiful woman in the world. She was 33 years old when she came to Bradford. She traveled by her own special railroad car, with a cook, a waiter, and 3 servants. She appeared here in May of 1883 in a play called The Honeymooners. The audience in the Wagner Theater that night was not particularly thrilled with the performance. They said it was a coldly critical reception of Mrs. Langtry, and what some saw to praise and others to disparage, they said on the whole it was better than expected. Apparently, she did not have the greatest voice in the world, although they thought she could dance pretty well. The theater was packed that night, of course, because everyone wanted to see what the most beautiful woman in the world looked like. During the first act, one man from Custer City shouted out, "She's a daisy!" and he was quickly hushed. But as you can imagine, every eye in the theater was fixated on Lily Langtry when she appeared. Here's another interesting actor that played at the Wagner Opera House. His name was Joseph Jefferson, often billed himself as Joe Jefferson, and he appeared at the Wagner on September of 1887. He'd been born in Philadelphia and had lived in Australia for a while during the Civil War. He returned to the States in 1866 and began to play the role of Rip Van Winkle. What's unique about him is that for the rest of his life, that's the only role he played. For over 40 years, he was known as a one-role actor, and the public never seemed to tire of it. And yes, he played Rip Van Winkle here at the Wagner. One of the most popular attractions at the Wagner Opera House was this man, John L. Sullivan, who appeared in January 3rd, 1894. He was known as the Boston Strong Boy, an Irish-American boxer, and he is recognized as the first heavyweight champion of glove boxing and the last heavyweight champion of bare-knuckle boxing. He was considered the first boxing superstar and one of the world's highest-paid athletes in his prime. After he retired, he went on the theatrical circuit. He wrote some plays in which he himself appeared. When he appeared in 1894, the Bradford era wrote, "Mr. Sullivan will find that acting provides more lucrative, and we should imagine more pleasant than the life of a professional fighter. To the ordinary citizen, it most assuredly seems more comfortable." Now, Martin Wagner, owner of the theater, was a fan of boxing, and he tried to bring that sport to the Wagner Theater whenever he could. On March 12, 1903, he brought two amazing boxers to the stage for an exhibition boxing match. The first one was James Jeffries. In 1903, he is the current heavyweight champion of the world. Jeffries was known for his enormous strength and stamina. He had fought in 24 fights, won 19 of them, 16 by knockouts, and had lost only one fight in his life. His daily routine consisted of a 14-mile run, 2 hours of skipping rope, medicine ball training, 20 minutes sparring on the heavy bag, and at least 12 rounds of sparring in the ring. In 1899, he had won the World Heavyweight Championship boxing title by knocking out Bob Fitzsimmons, ironically, the very same man that he would box against at the Wagner. The second man was Bob Fitzsimmons, a British boxer, who had won the World Championship in 1897 when he knocked out Jim Corbett. Fitzsimmons is still considered to be one of the hardest punchers in boxing history. He had fought 99 times, 65 of them were wins, and 59 of those wins were by knockouts. But he was a tall, rather skinny kind of man, and he often wore long woolen underwear while he fought to hide his skinny legs. The Bradford era was not kind to either man. They said, "Both men look like their pictures. Lanky Bob is made up largely of angles. He is bald-headed, has long arms, broad high shoulders, thin long legs, and a decidedly blonde complexion. James Jeffries, on the other hand, is a massive, shambling, broad-faced, deep-chested, dark-haired, awkward yet alert fighter. His arms are great muscular catapults, and he has a pair of hands that seem to have been especially constructed for jarring purposes." Only men attended the theater that night. It was 1903, after all, and no woman would have been seen at such manly entertainment. But even the men were somewhat disappointed. They had expected so much. The world champion boxer? The man he had defeated? Right here in Bradford? They thought there would be a real boxing match going on. But the whole fight only lasted for 3 rounds, and though it seemed that there might be a knockout at the finish, everything was being done for effect. When the Bradford men left the theater that night, it was with disappointment. But what did they expect? The two men were on the theatrical circuit after all. It was all for show. The newspaper wrote the next day, as the big audience went out into the night, they wondered if what P.T. Barnum had once said about the susceptible American public was really true. There's a sucker born every minute. This is the earliest photograph that we have of the J.G. McCrory store, which moved into the building at 62 Main Street when the Wagner Theater went out of business. McCrory's had actually been here in Bradford since 1899, just up the street at number 30 Main Street. But once the Wagner was gone, they needed a bigger store, and they moved down here to the corner of Chambers and Main. They remained here for the next 80 years. The man who founded J.G. McCrory Company was John Graham McCrory, whose name originally was spelled M-C-C-R-O-R-E-Y. But they said he was so frugal, and let's say cheap, that he took the E from his name so they wouldn't have to pay for an extra letter on any of the signs of his store. Anyone who was in Bradford before 1992 remembers McCrory's. They sold all sorts of things. McCrory's didn't always look like this, though. Once upon a time, it had another whole story to it. But a $100,000 fire on July 19, 1967, nearly destroyed the building. But repairs to the damaged structure were successful, although the top half of the building that now faces Main Street was entirely removed. The results of this restoration can still be seen when viewed from Main Street. And if you're on the Chambers Street side, you will see that the roof goes back and then becomes another third level again. That's the part that was removed. The store closed in '92. The distinction of being the oldest brick building on Main Street is just one of the fascinating features of this building. It's part of Bradford's historic district and certainly has earned the distinction as being one of the Bradford's most historic buildings. The landmark has a lot of information on the McCrory store. It was donated to us when they went out of business in 1992. It's a lot of tax records and tax receipts and things like that. But one of the most interesting things that I discovered in the file was a directive dating 1962 during the height of the Cold War. It's information to the employees as to what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. The directive begins, "It is not our purpose to alarm the personnel in our stores, but a situation exists for which we must plan. Proper preparation can prevent confusion, accidents, and save lives. To protect the company's assets and its people and customers who may be in the store at the time of an all-out nuclear attack and fallout, the company offers the following instructions as a guide." Here's part of that directive. According to the information we have now, the direction and time of fallout is predictable after a blast. Depending on how far the store is from the blast, there will be a certain amount of time before the fallout reaches the area. Depending on this, many people will be sent home. If there is less time, you will take shelter immediately in a designated area. And if you can't reach the designated area, then you can stay inside the McCrory store. And that's where the directive gets interesting. Here's what you're supposed to do if you're an employee and the bombs are coming. Gas, appliances, and gas mains must be turned off. The furnace room must have the door closed. If time permits, fire extinguishers are to be removed from the front of the store, and as many as possible placed on the stairway and in the area to be used as a shelter. And this is the part I like. Cash is to be collected and protected. When possible, it is to be deposited in a regular bank. Now, if you don't have time to go home or hit a designated shelter, how are you going to have time to get to the regular? The store manager will designate certain permanent employees to handle certain jobs. The cashier, floor girl, stockman, and assistants must know what to do in case of an emergency. For instance, where to guide people and how to protect them. Flashlights must be available, and guides must be at the stairs prepared to act in an emergency. The store manager and 2 or 3 store employees should receive instructions on first aid from local civil defense authorities. A battery-operated radio will be provided, and special efforts should be made to fill with water whatever receptacles are handy. Vacuum bottles, pitchers, pails, anything that is handy can be used for this purpose. People will need the water and what food is available. Blankets, clothing, and any other stock on hand necessary to protect and maintain people should be gathered for use. And here's the best part. No attempt is to be made to collect money for articles in the store used. The usual place for people to take shelter in one of our stores is in the downstairs stockroom. However, there is no downstairs in this McCrory's. So then the walled-in stockroom on the main floor is the next best bet. As I said at the beginning of this video, it is ironic that the name of this building is now Moments to Remember. There have been so many moments to remember in the past 144 years. So the next time you drive down Main Street and think to yourself, hey, there's the old Wagner Opera House, just remember all the famous people that have walked through that front door. Makes you think, doesn't it?